afternoon, everyone. Yes. My name is Lucy Zhang. I'm the director of the United Library. And thank you very much for coming to the library-sponsored faculty talk in celebration of the Theological Libraries Month. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Charles Cosgrove as our speaker today. As you may already know, he is a professor of early Christian literature here at Garrett-Evangelical. And he received his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1985.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he continued his study in Germany, Argentina, and even in Kent School of Law in Chicago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he has got lots of education. And as an established researcher and scholar, he published 8 books, as well as numerous articles. So we are really blessed to have him here. So he's going to give us a talk titled Eliza Garrett's Will. And let's welcome Dr. Cosgrove.
Thank you. This is part of a book project that I sort of wandered into, a double biography of Eliza and Augustus Garrett. There's no timetable for this. I'm just doing it for fun. And this is a little piece of that. So let me begin by thanking Dr. Chung for this opportunity, and I want to thank the librarians who helped me with the archival material, Dr. Chung and Kathleen Cordish and Mary Kay Reese and J. Lauren Mandala, and also Kevin Leonard over at Northwestern University Archives. On December 2nd, 1853, Eliza Garrett put her signature to a will in which she bequeathed the bulk of her estate, which was most of her real property, for the erection, fitting, furnishing, and endowing of a theological institution for the Methodist Episcopal Church to be called the Garrett-Biblical Institute. It is almost certain that in Eliza's mind, the name referred not to her, but to her husband, Augustus Garrett. And she no doubt understood this in 2 ways. First, real estate holdings that she assigned in her will for the founding of the school had been acquired by him through the course of his business activity in Chicago. Second, she believed, or at least wanted to believe, that he always intended to do something philanthropic with his estate, but never got around to it. Grant Goodrich, and there'll be quite a few names, so if you get lost, they're on the handout. Grant Goodrich took a different view. He thought that Augustus knew he ought to do something philanthropic with his wealth, but refused. It is very likely that Goodrich entreated Augustus more than once in the 1840s about making charitable donations to worthy Methodist causes. Proof of one such effort is a letter Augustus wrote to his associate J.R. Maloney in March of 1844. In response to entreaties by Goodrich about helping a struggling seminary, Augustus had enlisted Maloney and another associate named Colonel Mahoney. And yes, Mahoney gets very confusing when you read his correspondence over at Northwestern. Now, in his letter, Garrett tells Maloney that he and Colonel Mahoney should request that their names be removed from the subscription list for the seminary because Goodrich had led them to believe that they were buying stock, but now claimed that the monies received were a donation. So Augustus wrote, "I want you and Colonel Mahoney to each write me a letter requesting me to take your name off the subscription list for the Rockford Seminary for the following reasons. First, that the members of the Methodist, Mr. Goodrich in particular, has persecuted me, as well as yourselves, falsely and scandalously. And second, that when you subscribed, you were under the impression that you were subscribing for stock instead of giving it as a donation. Thirdly, that the amount of the debt to cancel the debt is considerably less than the amount they wish to raise. I do not intend to pay my subscription, neither do I want my friends to. I am not going to lend my aid to build up a church that will avail themselves of every opportunity they can get to injure me. I don't mind the amount of the money so much as I do the principle." Augustus was confused about the nature of the subscriptions and also the name of the school. There was a Rockford Seminary, but it was organized by the Presbyterians. The Methodists had a Rock River Seminary at Mount Morris, which must have been the school to which Garrett, Maloney, and Mahoney made their subscriptions. To clarify, the word seminary carried a much wider meaning in the early 19th century than it does today, and it could refer to almost any kind of school for young people. The Mount Morris Seminary was not a college or university or a theological school. When Augustus announced that he wanted his money back, Goodrich and others associated with the school accused him of reneging. That wounded Augustus's sense of honor, and he charged Goodrich and the rest of the Methodists with misusing him. This incident in 1844 no doubt dulled Augustus's receptivity to subsequent suggestions by Goodrich and other Methodists in Chicago that he uses wealth to promote Methodist projects. We also have a remark on the subject from Eliza in a letter she wrote to Bishop Leonidas Hamlin and his wife Melinda Hamlin in January of 1849, 2 months after Augustus died. "Affliction has indeed come upon me suddenly," Eliza writes. "Death has taken from me my beloved husband and protector, and almost I may say my only earthly relative. I had prayed and hoped that he would live to do some little good in the world before he should have been called up to give his account. But God's ways are not our ways. I feel to say, thy will, O Lord, be done. Mr. G. was sick only 6 days. A part of that time he was not considered dangerously ill. He conversed with me on the subject of his death and directed what disposition to make of his wardrobe, etc. He requested the Church of England service at his funeral, which was performed by an Episcopal clergyman in Clark Street Methodist Church. The last 3 days of his life, his mind was wandering most of the time. He spoke of the vanity of this world and how little we knew what a day would bring. Said he was not afraid to die, although he knew that he had not lived as he wished he had. I am sorry to say that he has left nothing satisfactory in regard to the future." The Hamlins, too, must have hoped that Augustus would make a substantial provision for some kind of philanthropy. And Bishop Hamlin, who with Melinda had recently visited the Garretts in Chicago, may have spoken to him directly about it. No doubt on occasions when Methodist friends urged him to do something for the church, Augustus, who is an amiable and gracious fellow, made a show of agreeableness, which encouraged people to think that he was considering plans along those lines. He was not. In her letter, Eliza reports Augustus's deathbed musing that he had not lived as he wished he had done. Nothing in that sentiment implies regrets that he had not contributed to a Methodist school. Eliza is the one who speaks of things left undone. I had prayed and hoped, she says, that he would live to do some little good in the world. This shows that at least by 1848, Eliza was urging Augustus to spend his wealth on a noble project. But he was of a different mind. Whatever Augustus may have meant to do in the way of philanthropy at any point in his life, it is clear that when he made out his will, he had no intention of giving any of his estate to a Methodist cause or to any other charitable endeavor. The copy of Augustus's will that was filed with Cook County perished in the Chicago fire of 1871. No other copy was preserved from his estate or from other sources, but aspects of the will are described in court opinions arising from a dispute among descendants of certain beneficiaries. The opinions are part of the so-called Flagler cases, which were eventually heard by the United States Supreme Court. In 1875, the Weekly Jurist, in a summary of the Flagler suits, described the will as follows. In December 1848, one Augustus Garrett departed this life, leaving a will by which he directed the income from his estate, after the payment of debts and legacies, to be divided between his wife Eliza, his 2 sisters Mary Banks and Letitia Flagler, and his 2 nephews James and Thomas Crow, in certain specified proportions, and further directing that on the death of his said wife and sisters, the real estate should be divided between Charles Flagler, son of Letitia, and said James and Thomas Crow, or if they should be dead, between their children per stirpum, which means in equal divisions. As this summary implies, Augustus granted to his male heirs, James and Thomas Crow, what the law calls fee simple or fee absolute. That is, an unrestricted inheritance by which they came into full possession of their portions and were entitled to do with them what they wished. But he gave to his 3 female heirs, Eliza and his 2 sisters, what is called a life estate. That is, a right to possess and use, as well as earn proceeds from, inherited real estate during one's lifetime, but not the right to sell it or give it away or pass it on as one's own estate. In this way, Augustus sought to ensure that the real estate he bequeathed to Eliza and his sisters would remain in his family and be passed on to his nephews. Eliza would have no power to bequeath any portion of it to the Methodist Church or any other person or organization. So I guess Garrett shouldn't exist. When the will was admitted to probate in February of 1849, Grant Goodrich, the mastermind, advised Eliza to renounce her interest in the will and assert her right of dower. Dower was a privilege established in English common law whereby a wife could reject her husband's will and inherit from him under a different legal provision. Traditionally, the right of dower was 1/3 of a husband's estate, but in Illinois, thanks to a statute enacted in the mid-1840s, a wife was entitled to half if she and her husband had no living children, which the Garretts did not. Through her lawyer, Eliza renounced the benefits of Augustus's will and asserted her right of dower, whereby she became entitled to 1/2 of the estate. This paved the way for her to devise a will of her own, in which she passed on a large portion of this inheritance to Garrett-Biblical Institute. You thought we were in a parallel universe where we were all going to disappear, right? Yes, right, yes. The bequest of property to fund Garrett is the 7th provision of Eliza's will, and it is followed by an 8th provision, which envisions that her estate would also support the establishment of a female college. Apart from the language of her will, we have no reports directly from Eliza about her wishes regarding the endowment of an educational institution or how her thinking evolved. The second-hand reports, however, all claim that her interest in providing money for a theological school coincided with the plans of various Methodist men on the scene. According to her lawyer, Grant Goodrich, Eliza spoke to him in 1853 about preparing her will and told him that she intended to devote the largest portion of her property to some benevolent purposes. Goodrich proposed a school for educating ministers, to which she, he says, replied that such a purpose had been for some time the subjects of her thoughts. She recognized that Methodist clergy exhibited zeal and devotion, Goodrich explained, but that most lacked sufficient education. I don't know how much of this is Goodrich and how much of this is Eliza. After speaking with Goodrich, she consulted her pastor, John Clark, and a few days later approached Daniel Kidder, a well-known figure in Methodist Sunday school work, who happened to be in town. She also talked to Hooper Cruz, her former pastor, who is coincidentally in Chicago. Each of these men, Goodrich says, gave her the same counsel he had, and Goodrich interpreted the presence and unanimity of all these voices as providential evidence of divine intent. Goodrich gives the impression that he was the first person she consulted, but in fact, she had written to Bishop Leonidas Hamlin 2 years earlier, asking his opinion about how she should disperse her estate. The letter does not survive, but a bit of Hamlin's reply is preserved in a biography of him. Unfortunately, the excerpt gives no clue to his advice. It does show, however, that by the time Eliza approached her lawyer about making out a will, she had been thinking about her will for at least 2 years and had probably talked over the question of a benevolent request or more with trusted friends. Goodrich dates his and the other ministers' conversations with her to sometime before the winter of that year, since the will was made out in early December. He and others probably spoke to her in the fall. There was then a concentration of influences on Eliza in the span of about a week or two in autumn of 1853. And Goodrich interpreted this confluence of unified voices as a providential sign. John Dempster appeared on the scene just 3.5 weeks after Eliza signed her will. He was stopping in Chicago on his way to Bloomington, where he was to meet with Methodists there who also had plans for a biblical institute. Philo Judson persuaded Dempster to speak with the Methodists in Chicago before he went on to Bloomington. On the day after Christmas, a meeting of Friends of Biblical Learning was held in the Methodist church known as Clark Street Church in Chicago. Dempster addressed this gathering, and in the discussion after his remarks, the group decided to establish a Biblical Institute Association. According to a handwritten document labeled Dempster Contract and dating to a few days after this meeting, the arrangements for the school were as follows. A board of 5 directors was established, composed of Grant Goodrich, Orrington Lunt, John Evans, John Clark, and Philo Judson. Dempster agreed to serve as professor and to recruit 2 other faculty. The directors promised to provide salaries and buildings, the latter to be constructed on newly purchased land for Northwestern University. Evans, Dempster, and Judson were given the task of drawing up articles of association, which were to be modeled on those of the Methodist Biblical Institute at Concord, New Hampshire, which Dempster had helped establish and where he had been serving as president. So you understand now where our original name comes from. Over the course of the following year, a building was constructed, and on February 15th, 1855, the school received its charter from the Illinois legislature. Eliza, who was kept apprised of these plans, understood that the directors, 2 of whom were also her executors, were in effect laying the foundation for fulfilling the provisions of her will in advance of her death, which she and everyone else no doubt assumed lay years in the future. Accordingly, she attended the dedication of the building in January of 1855. 11 months later, she fell gravely ill, and on her deathbed added a codicil to her will to make explicit that the Garrett Biblical Institute, named in the body of the will, shall be and is the Garrett Biblical Institute chartered by the Illinois legislature. The codicil is dated November 22nd, 1855. She died the following day. The testimonies about her will suggest that when Eliza began soliciting counsel, she envisioned devoting a large portion of her estate to, in her words, some good, or as Goodrich phrased what she told him, to benevolent purposes, in the plural. A school for training ministers had been in her thoughts, Goodrich tells us. That may well be true. This is as close as we can get to her own framing of her purpose before she received the opinions of Goodrich and the others who urged her to devote the bulk of her estate to a school for training ministers. Noticeably absent from all the anecdotes about Eliza's intentions before or after these conversations is any reference to the female college mentioned in her will. Whose idea was that? To answer this question, we have to examine the history that led to Northwestern University's female college. This tale begins with a Methodist minister named William P. Jones. With backing from his father and a recently gold-rich brother, this is 1840s, Jones established a Northwestern female college in Evanston in 1855. Whether Jones realized it or not, the university then being established in Evanston was also being organized under the name Northwestern. 2 words. Jones Female College blossomed for a while, then fell into financial difficulty. Francis Willard, who attended this school and subsequently taught at it, knew something of its history. According to Willard, the idea of a women's college course equal to that arranged for young men was unheard of when Northwestern University was founded, except at Oberlin and Antioch, Ohio. Vassar was unknown, Willard says, and the Harvard annex, Radcliffe, would have been looked on as an impiety. It was not at all in the plans of the men who founded Northwestern to open its doors to women, she says. Significantly, these same men were, for the most part, the Chicago Methodists who established Garrett. Orrington Lunt and Grant Goodrich being particularly instrumental in creating both institutions. A college for women was not on their minds, and they may have been dubious about such a thing. William Jones, then, was rather exceptional in his efforts to establish education for women on the par with men's colleges. But he did find some sympathetic ears. When he appealed to the Rock River Conference, he won support for the school from several faculty of the newly formed Garrett-Biblical Institute, from John Dempster, Daniel Kidder, Henry Bannister, and Francis Hemingway. Jones Female College also had the blessing of Bishop Matthew Simpson, but there were frictions between Jones and the university. The university trustees were annoyed at Jones for using Northwestern as the name of his school. Worried that people might confuse the two institutions, the university board appointed Grant Goodrich, Philo Judson, and Hooper Cruz to persuade Jones to change the name, and if he refused, to take further measures. Jones did refuse, but whatever legal actions Attorney Goodrich pursued came to nothing. Nearly a decade later, university trustees were still concerned that people would think Jones's school was part of the university. A handful of them proposed changing the university's name to Evanston University, but their effort failed. Opposition to the Jones School also led several Evanston citizens, including a number of university officials, to petition the governor of Illinois not to sign the bill granting the Jones College a charter. And when Jones petitioned the university for use of its building after fire destroyed his college, the university refused. During this same period, the university also got into a dispute with Jones over 3 acres of land that he had purchased from the university. It's clear then that the university trustees were unhappy with Jones for reasons that had nothing to do with their beliefs about women's education. And it happens that some university faculty members were helpful to Jones Female College. But the university board, which probably could have solved all its disputes with Jones by bringing his school into the orbit of the university, made no effort to do so, not even at a transitional point in the college's history when Jones accepted a diplomatic post in China under the Lincoln administration. In the mid-1860s, with Jones in China, his school struggling with debt, and Northwestern University showing no interest in admitting women, much less creating its own women's college, a number of Evanston women began organizing to do something for women's education, and it seems they had in mind from the beginning some provision at Northwestern University for women's education. Just a few years later, Northwestern reversed its policy on non-admission of women and began thinking about having a college for women at the university. The facts and circumstances of this change in the university position are as follows. On July 11, 1866, a petition was presented to the University Board of Trustees regarding, quote, the location of a Northwestern female college, unquote. This must not have been the Jones School, but a new female college which interested citizens were urging the board to incorporate into the university or at least to host. Presumably, the petition came from the same women who a few years later established the Evanston College for Ladies. The board's response to the 1866 petition was to refer it to a special committee appointed to consider the subject of electing a president. The implication is that the university intended to discover whether the new president supported the idea of a college for women. Charles H. Fowler was elected president that same day, and no action was taken with respect to the women's college. On September 25, 1868, a group of local women led by Mary Haskin and Melinda Hamlin formed the Ladies Educational Association of Evanston and began organizing the Evanston College for Ladies. A year later, the university began admitting women after electing a new president, Erastus Haven. According to Willard, who was privy at least to hearsay about negotiations with Haven, he made the admission of women to the university a condition of accepting the presidency. A series of actions at the board meeting in June appeared to corroborate Willard's claim. On June 22nd, Robert Queel, a member of the executive committee of the board, offered a resolution to admit women to the university on the same basis as men. The motion was tabled. The following day, the trustees elected Haven to the presidency. The motion about the admission of women was then taken off the table, and a substitute motion was advanced by Samuel Jewett. His motion repeated the language of the original motion and provided for implementation by the next college year. This motion was adopted. When the board communicated their decisions to Haven, he accepted the presidency. In his inaugural lecture upon assuming the helm of Northwestern, Haven spoke glowingly about coeducation, celebrated the recent decision of the university to admit women, and expressed hope that a female college would soon be established within the university. That in fact happened when Jones ceded his charter and merged his school with the Evanston College for Ladies in 1871, and that college was incorporated into the university. It is very difficult to judge from the distance of a century and a half whether Grant Goodrich and Orrington Lunt, who were executors of Eliza Garrett's will and founders of Garrett, opposed higher education for women or simply had other priorities. Lunt sent his daughter Cornelia to Chicago Central High School and then to a New York finishing school. A few years later, after Cornelia returned to Chicago, she was named to the first board of the Evanston College for Ladies. Whether her father approved is unknown. She does not give the impression in her sketches of childhood that she ever thought about seeking a university education or was raised by her parents with any such notions. Aside from her place on the board of the Evanston College for Ladies, there is no evidence that she was otherwise involved in promoting women's causes. It may be that she served on the college board more as a favor to friends than as an active promoter of women's rights. In any case, the story of women's higher education at Evanston makes it very doubtful that any of the Methodist men who counseled Eliza about the disposition of her estate suggested to her that some of it go to found a women's college. None of them were champions of university education for women, and only one of the men from whom Eliza sought counsel was later a supporter of the William Jones School. That man was Daniel Kidder, whose wife Harriet Kidder was also an advocate of women's higher education and probably an influence on him, and whose daughter Eva Kidder attended Jones Female College. Tellingly, two of Eliza's closest advisors, again, Grant Goodrich and Orrington Lunt, are not among the few Methodist men mentioned by Willard or others as being well disposed toward the Northwestern Female College or the Evanston College for Ladies. Moreover, Goodrich and Lunt were among the chief architects of the university who, in Willard's word, made no provision for women in their far-reaching plans. At most, one can say is that the men who were active in establishing Garrett and Northwestern University did not in the beginning contemplate university education for women, but eventually came around in response to the organizing efforts of local women, such as Mary Haskin and Melinda Hamlin, and under pressure from Erastus Haven, who made women's admission to Northwestern a condition of assuming the presidency. The provision in Eliza's will for the female college reads as follows: And in case at any time, the said trust property, the rents, issues, and proceeds thereof, shall exceed the amount necessary to build, fit, furnish, endow, and support said biblical institute, as aforesaid, I direct and devote the surplus to accumulate or otherwise be invested for accumulation for the purchase of a site and the erection within the city of Chicago or its vicinity of a female college. Frances Willard would one day comment, even the good Mrs. Garrett while she made mention in her will of doing something for women's education, conditioned this upon a contingency so remote that it was practically certain never to arise. In short, the will was framed in such a way that her executors and the trustees of Garrett would never be compelled to fulfill this clause. Grant Goodrich, who wrote up the will, knew that this formulation was purely discretionary. Hence, the provision for a female college must have been Eliza's. And Goodrich probably talked her out of dividing her estate between two institutions. That would explain the toothless language about the college. If the idea of a female college was purely Eliza's and not that of the men who advised her, it's worth asking whether anyone outside the circle of the founders of Garrett and Northwestern encouraged her to consider using her estate to establish an institution of higher education for women. One person comes to mind, Melinda Hamlin, a well-educated woman, a noted champion of women's rights, and a friend of Eliza Garrett. Melinda Hamlin was the second wife of Bishop Leonidas Hamlin. She assisted him in editing the Ladies' Repository, and after his death moved to Evanston, where, among other things, she led women's efforts to build a dormitory for Garrett and helped Mary Haskin organize the Evanston College for Ladies. She also served on that school's first board of trustees. Although the Hamlins did not live in Illinois during Eliza's years in Chicago, Eliza and Augustus entertained them occasionally when they stopped in Chicago. 4 surviving letters from Eliza to Mrs. Hamlin show that Eliza counted Melinda as a clear friend and confidant. These letters all date from the period when Eliza was planning her will, but none mentions that topic. There were likely other letters to the Hamlins, however, such as the lost letter mentioned by Bishop Hamlin's biographer. Unfortunately, it appears that the papers of neither Leonidas or Melinda Hamlin ever found their way into an archive. And perhaps this was the subject of Eliza's letter to Bishop Hamlin, that is the school was, in 1851. In any case, it's clear that from the way that she went about composing her will in 1853, that she was not a person to act without consulting others. Hence, she probably discussed the idea of a women's college with friends, perhaps especially with the Methodist women she knew. Melinda Hamlin would have been a source of encouragement. Let me briefly conclude by noting several of the other provisions of Eliza's will that are also revealing. After Augustus died, Eliza moved in with a friend and was eventually given a permanent home by the Walter S. Gurnee family. Gurnee was a businessman and served as a term of mayor of the city. Augustus and Walter must have been friends, and presumably Eliza and Mary Gurnee were also friends. The Gurnees had 6 children at the time and that Eliza lived with them, and Eliza left money to 2 of the girls, to Delia, who was about 13 when the will was composed, and to Mary Evelyn, who was about 10. Eliza also left sums of money to several of her own relatives and to certain other friends. All told, there are 11 monetary bequests to individual persons. 5 of these are females, and the bequests to them amount in total to $15,000. The total monetary bequests to males total somewhat less, $12,000. The total monetary bequest, there is also something notable in the bequest to certain female beneficiaries, namely in the gifts to Delia and Evelyn, who were under the age of 21 when the will was made. The wording contains some additional language, specifically the expression, to her separate use and control. Without this wording, the gifts to the girls would have been in their father's control, and, unless placed in a trust for them with an outside trustee, could have been used by Walter Gurnee in any way he saw fit. Eliza's intention was to give these 2 girls money of their own outside of anyone else's control. She must have been very sensitive to the predicament of a woman who was completely dependent on a man for money. In her day, a married woman's legal status was that of a femme couverte, without the right to own, manage, or sell property, including property she brought to the marriage. A single woman who was not under the legal guardianship of her father could exercise financial independence, but a married woman could not. Apart from a special legal arrangement, a wife could own nothing. This was Eliza's relation to the money and property in her marriage to Augustus. All of it belonged solely to him, and even in death, he endeavored to deny Eliza any final say over his property by granting her a life interest in his estate, which was the bulk of his wealth. But Goodrich showed her a way around that. And in 1853, having circumvented her dead husband's wishes by inheriting from him under the doctrine of dower, she willed most of his estate to people and institutions of her own choice. And she further instructed Grant Goodrich to write bequests to Delia and Mary Evelyn in words that would give them sole control of the money she left them. As it turned out, one of these two girls, Delia, never married and eventually became a figure of note in high society. We find later mention of her in the newspapers as a wealthy 70-year-old dividing her time between New York and Paris. It was probably not the bequest of Eliza that made this possible. Her father, after all, was a very wealthy railroad man. Delia's lifestyle may not have been a mode of existence that the unassuming, frugal, and church-devoted Eliza would have hoped for her. But Delia's independence expressed, nonetheless, the financial freedom that Eliza wished for women. Thus, in two particulars of her will, the clause about the female college and the bequest to Delia and Mary Evelyn, Eliza sought to do something for women's elevation and independence. And if she was to some extent talked into founding a ministerial school by a gaggle of Methodist men, these other two interests were peculiarly her own and show that she was more progressive than they. Thank you. I'm happy to field any questions. I have limited knowledge, so I'll tell you when I don't know something. Yes?
Did you mention a date when one of those schools for women was incorporated into Northwestern University?
Yes, so that school,
I lost track of which school is which.
yeah, the Evanston College for Ladies, organized around 1868. I think it's got its charter in 1869, in 1868 or 1869, one of those years. And then Haven came to Northwestern, and women were admitted to the school. And then in 1871, the Jones School was merged into the Evanston College for Ladies. And Northwestern University has the graduation program for that year, and it says at the bottom, and they had an act, a ceremony, in which that merger was accomplished in 1871 at graduation. And then immediately the college was moved, the merged college was moved into Northwestern.
All right, thank you.
So I think it would be 1871.
71. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Jones Residential College on Northwestern's campus, is that after the Jones's School for Women?
I have no idea. I don't know what that is, at Jones's
They have a
Residential College.
I just thought that'd be really interesting.
And it's
if
called
they had
Jones?
this-
I
yeah,
don't
they
know.
had this,
You know,
relationship with Jones. And
It's
had a name
possible,
that's,
but some of these names that show up are held by many people, right? There are Clarks everywhere. At the time that this is going on in 1853, Eliza's going to the Clark Street Church. The minister is John Clark, and Eliza's maiden name is Clark. So I don't know, Jones, it could be the same thing, right? Yes.
I'm always fascinated with this Bishop Hamlin's name because I used to live in Minnesota where Hamlin University is.
Right.
So have you checked, are there any Hamlin papers at Hamlin University?
No.
Or at Drew? Even
No.
No. At the Methodist
I have
Archives?
checked. I'll tell you what I think about this. So Hamlin donated $25,000 to found Hamlin University. They don't have his papers. He and others made their money in the land speculation at the same time as Garrett was making his money. It's all part of the same world. Tremendous. The Potawatomis and other native peoples were driven out of Illinois in a treaty, but after a war, right, under duress, moved into Iowa to patch of land the scouts who went out to look at it said was a desert. They were led out there, and all the land in Illinois, besides what is the little bit that had been possessed by settlers already, it went up for auction. Federal Land Offices sold land. Augustus Garrett was there as an auctioneer, making fees off all that sale of land. And then he bought land in Chicago and elsewhere. And these Methodist ministers were also buying land. And we have at least one letter in the archives where Philo Judson is writing to, Orrington Lund, I think, is writing to Philo Judson about how much they just made on a deal, and they wish they'd brought Goodrich in. So they're making a lot of money, and Bishop Hamlin ended up with quite an estate as a result of that. And so he founded that Methodist University in Minnesota. But his biographer evidently got all his papers from Melinda Hamlin, and when the biography was done, did not deposit the papers in any institution. My guess is these biographies are mostly hagiographies, celebrations of the piety and the works. They're not done by historians, they're done by other Methodists, ministers, and so he felt, well, you know, everything that needs to be known about Bishop Hamlin is now in my book. And there was another book that published some of his papers and addresses, so there was that. But all the letters and that kind of correspondence would have been voluminous, right? That probably, I don't know that it would have been destroyed at the time he finished the biography, but it sat in his attic and then heirs throughout at some point. Did not go to Drew, it did not go to Hamlin, did not go to Garrett, did not go to Northwestern. I can't find them anywhere. And then to find out information about Melinda Hamlin, there's even less information because nobody seemed to care about preserving the record of women. And unless they ran their own organization and had archives that women who worked for them then preserved, which occasionally happened, those were all lost, especially personal correspondence, for two reasons. It's not important, it's just women's letters, and two, there was a feeling about privacy. And so sometimes these materials were destroyed for that reason. We don't have Grant Goodrich's papers either, that I can find anywhere. Yeah.
Well, just I don't have a question, an observation. Caught my attention looking to this list, the name of Daniel Kidder. And Daniel Kidder was the third missionary in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's right. Yeah.
And he came in 1837, and at the age of 22, he was 22 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and he got there, and he had to come back to the U.S. because his wife died
Mm-hmm.
of malaria in Brazil, so he spent just 4 years over there.
Mm-hmm.
It caught my attention that somehow there is a kind of a connection.
And the fact that Eliza, yeah, it is. And the fact that Eliza sought him out, at least according to Goodrich, when he was in Chicago, made me wonder whether she had a friendship with his wife, who was a big promoter of women's rights and education. I'm guessing Eliza had lots of correspondence. And with people in Chicago, because you would send somebody a letter in town. In those days, letters were delivered like twice a day. They were just circulated around, so it's like the telephone, and then more widely. So this whole story is probably embedded in her letters in terms of her thinking about different causes.
If the Garretts owned a lot of land in Chicago, was part of that what would be in a Garrett farm in the Logan Square area now? Because I saw a map.
Really, yeah.
Some research that somebody else was doing that showed Grace United Methodist Church, which is EUB, but across the street from it was the Methodist Episcopal Church, was built on former Garrett farmland.
It's quite possible. Now there was more than one Garrett, but he owned pieces in various parts of Illinois and Michigan and Wisconsin. A lot of property he turned over, but he also retained some. So that is possible. As you know, I think what the seminary inherited was that very valuable property that's right at the bend of the river south, where the Republican National Convention, the first convention, held its meeting in the Wigwam and inaugurated or nominated Abraham Lincoln. So they owned the buildings there, and they built a wigwam, as so it was called, a big convention hall, to make money, and then they rented it out to the Republicans because they all, these were all Republicans at Garrett and at Northwestern. They were all part of the same group. It was very valuable land, but at the time that Garrett, the seminary, inherited it, the buildings had been burned down, so they weren't generating any money. And then at other periods, there were similar disasters, including the Chicago fire in 1871 that destroyed all the buildings that Garrett's had. There was also a Garrett block in Chicago. Find reference to it in the newspapers, a different place. And it was owned by Garrett Seminary. And I don't know if they inherited the land from Garrett or if they purchased land and then constructed buildings and and earned rents. But they were earning rents from that Garrett block as well. Yeah. Yes.
You said, the paper you presented is part of the bigger project. So I'm curious, where, you are moving into after your work around the Eliza Garrett. What's the next step?
Well, so I'm still, I did start at the beginning, and somehow I got onto the will, and so I worked on the will, and then I think maybe you made an invitation. I said, well, the will would be a great thing to do a talk on. So I don't know. I got ahead of myself a little bit, but I have to work on all the parts at once because they inform each other. I have written chapter 1, which is the beginnings in Newburgh Township, state of New York, and I visited the state of New York and where both Garretts grew up on the farm. I pretty much was able to locate where Augustus grew up. I took some pictures. I'm sure within the photo is his father's farmland where he grew up. But there's no way to know exactly where the farm was. And it's built up somewhat, but you still get a picture of the rural, and the Hudson River is just down the way. And I also, Eliza Garrett family farm, her father's farm, is in that area, but it's not on the Old North Road, so it's not pinpointed. But there's a history of the Old North Road that mentions the father and where his farm was. So that's how I could find that. Eliza's family went to the Marlboro Presbyterian Church, which was up in the next county. And we visited that church. It's still in existence, and we worship there. And it's a different building. It's a building that her brother built, or was one of the trustees, and contributed a lot of money to building. And from the church, you can almost see the Hudson River. And if you go down to the site of the old church where Eliza attended, you can see the Hudson River through the trees. And there's a cemetery next door where her relatives are buried. So we visited all that. And I found a descendant of her brother, and my wife and I met with her, and we've been corresponding. So she doesn't know anything, but I have someone to talk about all this stuff, So I send her things, and she takes photos of things for me, and she did some archival research for me and a few points. So we've been partnering a little bit. She's thrilled that she'd heard about this ancestor, Eliza Garrett. She knew nothing about her, but some money had come into the family, and they talked about this wealthy, so she's happy to. The Garretts had children, but none of them survived, so there are no direct descendants. I'm in the middle right now. I'm in the 1840s now. Working on Augustus, mayor. He was a mayor for 2 terms in Chicago. I'm trying to figure out his business dealings, and I'm doing my best to try to understand what's going on at Clark Street Church. Mary Carol and I have been in the attic looking at First Church stuff, and there are 3 or 4 safes that have archival material of some kind for which the combinations don't work. So naturally, we're like Geraldo Rivera, imagining that when we open these safes, all of these ledgers and all of this stuff that's going to tell everything we wanted to know. But it's probably going to be Sunday school literature from the 50s, 1950s, But still, until they're opened, it could be anything. Yes.
Charlie, was Garrett's charter originally a co-educational? Did it call for a co-educational institution?
No. I'm sure it didn't, but I'm not recalling what the exact language was. That's another question. When was the first woman admitted to Garrett, and whether it was in any way explicitly closed, you know?
Right, because that's what I'm wondering, because at the time, you wouldn't expect to have
Right.
women, but I just wondered if they were specifically excluded, or if.
Yeah, whether it said training of ministers
Yes.
or training of men for ministry,
Exactly.
whether it uses that gender-exclusive language. Well, thanks for that question. I'm going to go look and see. Yeah, because what's very nice is now all the Illinois laws right to the beginning are have been Googled, put in Google Books, so you can look up all that old legislation with if you get the right key terms and read the actual language pretty much in the book, right? You're just looking at an image of the book. So the Garrett Charter is there, and the Evanston College for Ladies is there, and Melinda Hamlin is mentioned, and Mrs. Kidder is mentioned. I forget her first name now. Yeah, so you can. Maybe it was Harriet. Is it Harriet? Yeah, Harriet Kidder. Yeah, thank you. Between Maloney's and Mahoney's and 455 Clarks, I forget some names. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.